.NET 9 recently came out, and within a year from now, .NET 10 will be out. That can feel like a very fast pace. A new LTS, or long-term support version for .NET, comes out every 2 years, and the support for an LTS expires after 3 years. In between every LTS, we get an STS, or short-term support version, and that version only lasts for 18 months of support. That's what .NET 9 is, the 18-month support version. One common complaint I hear is that this cycle is just too fast. Based upon my experience working with dozens of companies on their applications, I would argue that this pace is probably just about right. In fact, if it gets too much longer, it can actually hurt companies. In this video, we're going to cover why the upgrade cycle actually helps your company succeed. Now, just like planning out upgrades for your application, you need to be thinking about upgrading a career. Succeeding in software development isn't just about knowing more syntax. It's about having real-world experience and wisdom. That's what sets my courses apart from others. They aren't just about teaching you syntax or buzzwords. They're about training you on how to be a real-world developer. I would encourage you to go to I Am Tim Corey and check out the Dev Pass. For one monthly rate, you can access dozens of real-world training courses that set you up for long-term success in today's shifting marketplace. Okay, let's jump over to, I use Excalidraw to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to really setting things up for success when it comes to how long the LTS window is. Now let's start by drawing out a graph here. So we're going to draw, arrow. Here we go. We're going to draw an arrow here, and we'll put another arrow right here. And so you have the X and the Y axis. And yes, this is, just a rough draw out. But what we're going to say here is this is the years between updates. And let's drag that out so you can see it better. And we'll put down here, this right down here is feature changes. Okay, so this is an important thing to think about when you're talking about how long between LTS versions. That's what we're going to talk about here is just LTS version for now. We could say between every version because this is important too. So let's just say that when you build your app, this right here, that's your version 1. Okay, so we'll put in here V1. So that's when you built your app. So you built your app with the latest technology at the time when you started building it. Now, imagine for a minute that we talk about, this scale might be 10 years to the top. And you might say, well, I would love to have a 10-year cycle so that .NET is supported for 10 years. So if .NET 8 was the LTS version, which it is, if Microsoft would support that for 10 years, that'd be awesome. Okay, so let's say they do that. And so we're going to draw another box. And actually, I'll just copy this box here. Let's copy this box, and we're going to say that version 2 is probably out here, okay? So version 2, which is where we're upgrading to the new version of .NET, it's out here because the number of years is about 10. That's what we're hoping for. But if you see, that also means a number of feature changes have happened, okay? So in between these two is a lot of change. And this is the important bit to understand. Is that line right there represents an almost insurmountable amount of feature changes. The number of things that have been deprecated, the number of things that have been changed, the number of things that have changed how they do things is so large that companies fail to make this jump. And that's what has happened. So Microsoft isn't just making this decision based upon no information. They actually did things this way for .NET Framework. .NET Framework would have about 7 or 8 years in between support versions, or so the version support would last for 7 or 8 years, sometimes more. So that's a long window. So what happened? Well, companies would stay on their version 1 of .NET. The app would change, but the version they were using would be that same version of .NET Framework. Maybe it's .NET Framework 3.5. Well, .NET Framework 4 comes out years later, and this gap here, the number of feature changes is too much to overcome. So companies say, oh, we just can't make that change. It's going to be a long time doing it. It's going to take a year of work just to upgrade the new version of .NET Framework. So we're not going to do it. And if you note, if you are interviewing in the marketplace today, you'll find a lot of companies that are still running .NET Framework 3.5 or .NET Framework 4 or .NET Framework 4.8 even. They're stuck in .NET Framework land. And a significant portion, if not most of them, are because the jump to the next version is too expensive in their minds. Okay. Now, you may say, well, Tim, they're using third-party libraries. Yes, they are. Those third-party libraries may be holding them back because they too have that same problem. Now, imagine that this is floor 2. Okay. So if we're in a house. So this is floor 2, and then down here on the bottom is floor 1. Well, imagine if you're in a house and you want to get from floor 1 to floor 2. How would you do that? You wouldn't just have this big, wall in front of you that is 8+ feet high that you'd have to, jump from here all the way up. You wouldn't do that. Instead, what you do is you would break that jump up into smaller chunks, okay? And you'd probably go to this height, and then you'd have another level, and then you'd have another level. What we're creating here is we're creating stairs, okay? So this is what we have with the versions of .NET. See, imagine, let's delete this line here. Imagine between version 1 and version 2, we decided to put another version. Let's paste another one here, but we'll put halfway in between. So it's less years, but it's also less changes. And you say, well, that's still too difficult. Well, we can put another one in between, and another one, and maybe one after, and another one after. So, okay, this jump isn't very big. Let's put this as, this is version 2. This is, framework. We're talking about the .NET versions here. So the change is just, this doesn't represent a specific .NET version, just so we're clear. But now, yes, we're making 7 upgrades, not 1. Okay, not from 1 to 2. We're actually 6 upgrades. So, but what are we doing? We're creating stepping stones. And the amount of change from 1 to 2 is now very little, which means it's a lot easier to make that change. So yes, you don't have as many years between those updates, but it's an easier step. So maybe it takes you a little bit of time and it is some work, but it's an easier step. And now you're here. And now you work for a year or 2 and a new version comes out. Let's say you're doing LTSs. Every 2 years, you want to start doing an upgrade and you have a year to do it while still in support. So now you're making this step, okay? And it's not a big step. There's not a lot of changes between 2 and 3. And now you have 2 years to work on it. And then you make another step and it's not that big a step. And you keep doing this. And all of a sudden you're at version 7 or the second floor of your house and you've been able to make these steps. It's like trying to go up your stairs. Do you go up 10 stairs at a time? No, that's an insurmountable challenge. You can't just do that easily. Even 4 steps at a time is just probably too much. It's difficult. But if you do 1 step at a time, you're doing more work in the fact that you're taking, let's say, 10 steps to go up a flight of stairs, but at the same time, each step isn't that difficult, okay? So, it might be, in theory, you'd seem like, oh, it's simpler to do 1 action to go from floor 1 to floor 2, but it's a very large leap. So from, in this case, version 1 to version 7, that's a very large leap. It's an almost insurmountable. In fact, it is insurmountable for most companies. But this smaller step process can be easier. So this isn't something where you want to think about it as, oh, there's so much change, this is a bad thing. What you're seeing here is stairs and the ability to go up those stairs and to be able to get to that next level, to be able to continue to stay on the cutting edge or close to the cutting edge, or even just in the modern development era without an extreme amount of work. So right now, if you look in the job market, you'll see tons of jobs for .NET Framework. Do you want to work for a job that's working .NET Framework? Probably not. And do you think those jobs will be great jobs to have going forward? Probably not. Because you've got a stagnant language. You can't use new versions of Visual Studio. You can't use some of the new cloud features. You can't use a lot of stuff. You can't use third-party libraries for the most part. There's lots of stuff that just goes out of style, out of use because they're old versions. And .NET Framework, by the way, is still supported. Okay, .NET Framework 4.8 still supported by Microsoft. It will be for years. But what you've got is a stagnation. And so you probably don't want that. So what's the alternative? Well, it's to take these smaller steps. The cool thing is that not only if you count these as LTS versions, well, you can take these steps and maybe you find out, hey, you know what? Even those steps might be a little bit hard for our company. There's intermediate steps in between. There's half steps. They're called the STS versions. You can go to that next version 1.5, version 2.5, and make more steps, but smaller steps, and be able to get from your current version to the modern version all the time. All right. Now, you don't have to. You could say, you know what? I'm going to skip 2 and 3 and go right to 4. I'm going to just not be in support for a while and skip over. And that's going to be a harder upgrade, but it's doable. Just like taking 2 or 3 steps at a time on the stairs is doable, even if it's a bit harder. So it's possible to do all these different things, but the longer the span is between versions, the harder it's going to be to upgrade to the next version. Now, there's probably some of you are saying, Tim, this is an overly simplistic graph. It's not that straight line. And I agree with you to an extent. So let's talk about kind of the realities, and I'll do it down here, kind of the realities of upgrading. So let's pretend for a minute, let's grab this block right here, and we're going to say that this is a no matter what cost for an upgrade. Okay, so this is the base cost. We're going to give these a numeric scale. So we're going to say this is a 4. Okay, so no matter what you do, it's a 4, meaning that it doesn't matter if you upgrade versions of .NET, every year, every 2 years, it's always going to have a base cost. So it's going to take, running a whole bunch of unit tests, doing some tests on your own, some integration tests, working with QA to validate the system, checking all your different assets and endpoints and making sure that everything still works, checking all of your third-party libraries and so many other things. There's always going to be a base cost for upgrading no matter the upgrade. So that's the base cost. And let's just say that, we're going to do, this is going to be a 1, meaning every version of .NET. So it's the simplest, the smallest to upgrade to the next version of .NET. Now, let's say that instead you're going to do an LTS. Well, an LTS might be, let's just drag this out here, might be kind of like double the size. It's a 2 as far as work. There's some extra work because there's twice as many changes. Again, coming back to this idea that the more feature changes you have, the more difficult it might be. So, with a 1, that's a significant amount of work, but it's not a whole lot more to do it every 2. So you see that? So, let's just count them up. If you say that every STS to LTS to STS to LTS, basically every version of .NET, if you upgrade every 1, maybe it's a total of 5 on our scale of difficulty or the amount of time it's going to take. Whereas it's only 6 to upgrade every LTS, from .NET 6 to .NET 8 to then .NET 10. So you notice here is not a whole lot of extra work because you've got this base cost either way. Okay, so the thought is, yeah, if that's the base cost and that's going to happen either way, then maybe we should wait for every, I don't know, every 4 versions. So from .NET 6 to .NET 10. Okay. So yeah, it seems like there's not as, it's not a whole lot more work to do that as opposed to, imagine if we did the LTS and did it twice. So let's just copy that and paste it in. Notice comparably, it's a whole lot more work to do the LTS twice than it is to do every other LTS. That's the theory, okay? And in some ways, I understand that. That can be true. But again, coming back up to this graph right here, number of feature changes, the further you go over to the right, the more feature changes you have to deal with, the more complex it's going to be to upgrade. The more things that are deprecated, the more things that have to be changed because we're doing things differently now. That is going to cause some issues. So while it may feel tempting to start skipping LTSs or to, do things that are a longer span or want to, even if you have to do the every 2 because you want to stay in support. It may feel tempting to do these, every other LTS because of the fact that it feels like less time, but really this is a lie too, because it doesn't scale this way. That 4 might be more like this. And at some point it goes like this because it's just too hard to do because of the fact that the number of changes has overwhelmed you to the point where you don't have time to do all the changes before your boss says, you're spending too much time on this, don't do this. So there's a breaking point here. And that's where there is a way to make this better and make it more logical to do every LTS. And the way to make it more logical is to address the 4s, okay? Address this row right here. Because imagine for a minute that you found a way to take this base cost, no matter which upgrade you do, and shrink it. A little, a lot, doesn't really matter. If you shrink it, guess what happens? It makes every upgrade easier. And if you shrink it enough, well, then all of a sudden you're talking about, 2 as opposed to, 2 and then 3. All of a sudden you're saying, hey, we could do this every year or every 2 years. But you have to shrink this base cost. Now, how do you do that? Because that's important. Well, again, this right here, this every year or every 2-year upgrade cycle actually gives you an opportunity. Because you're going to come to your boss and say, you know what, boss, we need to upgrade every 2 years because every 2 years a new LTS comes out. So we should probably stay on that in order to stay in the support window. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to do this upgrade. We're going to be, quote unquote, forced to do this upgrade. But here's where you can be the hero. Here's where you can help your company, is work on shrinking the base cost of any upgrade by automating as much as possible. And that will help not just your upgrades, but it will also help things like adding new features. Because one of the upgrades you want to do is you want to make sure you have a continuous integration, continuous deployment process. You want to have CI/CD set up. But then you want to have as much code coverage on unit tests and integration tests as possible, because you want to be able to test within a reasonable doubt all of your application when you make changes. So when you make a change to .NET, instead of doing a whole bunch of manual testing and validation and verification and all the rest, you have, as much as possible, automations do that. Now, you probably cannot practically do all of your testing via automations. There's still some at least spot checking you to do, or some work you need performed to validate and verify that, yes, we're on the right path. Now, if you find out, oh, we didn't test for that, create a test for it. But the more you can do, the more you can shrink this box. So now your validations aren't just oh, we hope it works. We got QA testing it and trying it, and QA spent 3 months verifying in order for us to go. And therefore, it's so hard to get from V1 to V2 because of that 3-month verification cycle that has to happen. Well, you shrink that down to, we ran all the automated tests, they all passed. And now we are 98% certain we'll run some QA testing just to double check. And that makes the upgrade process a whole lot easier. Again, it makes adding new features easier. It makes bug fixes easier. It makes your application in general easier to maintain and update because of the fact that you don't have to do a whole bunch of manual testing in order to verify that your application is working correctly. So that, again, will shrink down the amount of overhead that any upgrade gives you. So you'll be able to do these upgrades faster because they take up less overall time. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here is yes, this is a fast cycle. And there can be an argument made for maybe the LTS should be 4 years instead of 3, or I really don't think 5 years is a good idea. I think it really should be no more than 4 years. I think 3 years is probably about the sweet spot, just because of the fact that if you do things any slower, what happens is naturally companies start saying, well, even that's just too fast, or we're going to wait for the next LTS. We're going to kind of skip one or whatever. And they have bigger and bigger gaps between upgrades. And it gets harder and harder to do that, to bridge that gap. You're doing it less often. So one of the things that people talk about a lot is deployments. Don't deploy on Friday. You got to be careful in your deployments. You got to verify everything before you deploy. Make sure that you have everybody on standby when you deploy. Make sure you can test for any bugs or problems. But the more times you deploy to a real environment, the less you have to do that, right? At some point, you can deploy on a Friday at noon or Friday at 5 p.m. and go away for the weekend and feel confident. And that's only when you have gotten to the point that you've done deployments a lot and that you have a validated system in place to check your new changes before they go live. Well, the same thing is true with updates. When you're updating from .NET 5 to 6, it may take a while because you don't have any practice doing it. You don't have the automated systems in place. You don't have the checks in place. But if you invest the time and do that, not only will upgrading from .NET 6 to .NET 7 be easier, but it will also be easier for all the rest of your stuff you do too. It will save you time. It's the idea that, if you have to chop down, you have 6 hours to chop down a tree, spend the first 5 hours sharpening your axe. This is what we're talking about, is sharpening your axe. The more that you spend time doing this, the better off you'll be. And you're not going to get all of it right the first time. You're not going to have all the unit tests and all the integration tests and all the rest in version 1 necessarily. In fact, you might have none. You might say, well, Tim, it's too late, right? Well, no. Before version 2, like before the next version comes out, write 10, write 50, write 100. Every time you do a bug fix, write a unit test. Okay? Those kind of things will help you the next time. If you think about today only, you're always going to get stuck. But if you pick your head up a little bit and say, how can I do a little bit extra today or do things a little bit differently today in order to make tomorrow better, you'll have a better experience. So maybe now your version 1 to version 2 upgrade, maybe it takes, it's a 4 because you don't have a lot. But version 2 to version 3, maybe it's a 3.5 because you've done some things. And 3 to 4 might be down to a 2.5 because you've done a lot of extra stuff. And all of a sudden, you got this process getting better and better and better, and it's going to help you out in the rest of your life too. So yes, the upgrade cycle is very fast. Whether this between version 1 and version 2 is a year or 2 years, that's still a very fast cycle. But at the same time, no, it's not. Because if it's any shorter, well, yes, that's a very fast cycle, but any longer, and you've got these gaps that are too hard to bridge or start to be. So my argument would be that Microsoft doesn't change it, that LTSs are every 2 years or every 3 years of support, every 2 years they come out. I think that's a pretty good cycle for helping companies upgrade from one version to the next. It also means that less changes are in every version of .NET. And that's important too. In fact, with .NET 9, there are very few breaking changes. I'm going to do a separate video on that, on the breaking changes, but they're very few, and they're not that significant for the vast majority of people. I'm sure that there are absolutely companies that are like, hey, this is a breaking change that is going to break us. We got to make some major shifts. But for the most part, 99% of people aren't going to have a problem with the upgraded .NET 9. So upgraded .NET 9 really isn't about breaking changes, and there's a lot of improvements that will come from these upgrades. And that's the other thing people miss is that you say, well, we're going to go from 1 to 7, and we're just going to wait all this time. Well, not only do you miss out on the ability to make this change because it's too far to go, but you also miss out on the performance benefits of version 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So every time .NET comes out, there's performance improvements. We're going to go over in a separate video the performance improvements in .NET 9, and they're kind of mind-blowing. In fact, just upgrading your application to .NET 9 will make it go faster. And that's important. That means cheaper cloud costs. It means more concurrent users. It means without changing any other code, all of a sudden your application is more responsive and can handle more people for the same code. So just that is a huge reason to go and get these upgrades even more quickly if possible. And the way to do that is to shrink your base cost, the cost it takes to do any one version of .NET upgrade, to the point where you're doing every version of .NET because it's that valuable to your company. Okay? So that's why I really think that the version changes are really important, because .NET Framework was a 1 to a 7. Okay? There was a huge gap to the point where companies just weren't making the leap. So there's companies still on .NET Framework 3.5, still on 4, still on 4.5, and some are on 4.8, because that leap was hard to do. So with the smaller changes, the leap is so tiny. I've upgraded the suggestion site, which started in .NET 6. I've upgraded to every version of .NET with basically nothing more than just changing the version number. And while it's not a super complicated app, at the same time, it's complicated enough. It's got external systems it depends on, NuGet packages and all the rest. And it's pretty much just change the version number. So really important to think about. And I want you to look at this and think about how you can prepare your company for long-term success. Because getting stuck down here is not long-term success. That is long-term irrelevance. And that is harder, more expensive development at some point where you have less people to pull from and less third parties to support you and all the rest. But making this transition all the way up to 7, that's going to mean having, the most possible support and the most possible third-party resources and the most possible performance and security and all the rest. So it's really important to do. And if you do it right, it can be a much simpler process than maybe what you're doing even today. All right. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.